In September of 1940, a small metal deed box, the kind used to store wills and property contracts, crossed the Atlantic Ocean. It had been designed with one failsafe. If the ship carrying it was struck by a torpedo, the box would fill with water and sink to the bottom of the sea, because what was inside could never be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The night before the journey began, that box sat under a hotel bed in central London. The next morning, it was strapped to the roof of a taxicab and driven through the streets to Euston Station. On the platform, an eager railway porter grabbed the case and nearly disappeared into the crowd, and for a few terrible seconds, the man carrying it almost lost sight of Britain's greatest technological secrets. Inside that box was a device the size of a bar of soap. It could generate 1,000 times more microwave power than anything else in existence. Beside it lay blueprints for radar systems, jet engines, self-sealing fuel tanks, a new kind of plastic explosive, and a scientific memorandum suggesting that an atomic weapon was not just theory, but an engineering problem with a solution. This was the accumulated genius of British science. Everything the nation had invented while fighting alone against the most powerful military machine in history. The man who organized this mission gave all of it to the United States, freely, without contract, without conditions. In return, he expected American factories to mass produce what British laboratories had conceived. It was the most consequential act of technological generosity in the history of warfare. America took everything and never said thank you. And the man who made it happen? His own government rewarded him with exile. His name was Sir Henry Tizard, and this is his story. Henry Thomas Tizard was born on the 23rd of August, 1885, in Gillingham, Kent, within sight of the great naval dockyards of Chatham. His father, Captain Thomas Henry Tizard, was an officer in the Royal Navy and a distinguished hydrographer who had sailed on the famous HMS Challenger expedition, the voyage that mapped the ocean floor and founded the science of oceanography. Young Henry grew up among sailors and ships. He remembered being encouraged to climb rope ladders at the dockyard as a small boy. The sea was in his blood, and there was never any question about his future. He would follow his father into the Royal Navy. Then, at the age of 14, a routine medical examination discovered a blind spot in his right eye. A specialist said it would probably clear up in time, and it eventually did. But the Navy would not wait. The door closed, and British history turned on a failed eye test. Tizard won a scholarship to Westminster School on the strength of his mathematics. Then, in 1904, entered Magdalen College, Oxford, as a scholar. He took first-class honours in mathematics before switching to chemistry and taking first-class honours in that as well. In 1908, he travelled to Berlin to study under Professor Walter Nernst, the great physical chemist who would later win the Nobel Prize. It was in that laboratory that Tizard formed a close friendship with another ambitious young physicist, a wealthy, eccentric man named Frederick Lindemann. They admired each other's intellect. They shared a passion for science. And within 30 years, they would become the bitterest of enemies, locked in a feud that shaped the outcome of a world war. When the Great War broke out, Tizard was commissioned in the Royal Garrison Artillery. But training recruits in Portsmouth was not enough for a man of his restless intelligence. In 1915, his eyesight having improved at last, he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps at Upavon. Here, something remarkable happened. Tizard did not simply study aircraft from a laboratory. He learned to fly and became his own test pilot. He measured things that had never been measured before, applying a scientist's precision to the chaos of flight testing. By 1917, he was running the experimental station at Martlesham Heath in Suffolk, evaluating every new aircraft and weapon for the British military. By the end of the war, Tizard held the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and had received the Air Force Cross. But his greatest asset was not any medal. It was an ability that almost nobody else possessed. The ability to stand in a room full of generals and explain what the scientists were saying, then walk into a laboratory and explain what the generals needed. Charles Percy Snow, the novelist and physicist who knew both men, later wrote that Tizard was a trusted interpreter between the world of science and the world of the military. It was this gift, not brilliance in a single discipline, but the rare talent of bridging two worlds that did not understand each other, that would make him the most important scientific organizer Britain ever produced. In 1934, a junior official at the British Air Ministry named Albert Percival Rowe sat down and did something no one had thought to do before. He went through every single file the ministry held on the subject of air defense. What he found, or rather what he did not find, alarmed him. Fewer than 50 documents. That was the sum total of Britain's scientific preparation against aerial attack. Rowe wrote an urgent letter to his superior, Harry Wimperis, the Director of Scientific Research. The message was blunt. Unless science could find some way to come to the rescue, any war within the next 10 years was bound to be lost. This was not pessimism, it was arithmetic. The prevailing military doctrine of the 1930s held that the bomber would always get through. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, had said so publicly. And he was right, because Britain had no reliable means of detecting an incoming aircraft. The Royal Observer Corps relied on human eyes and ears. Acoustic mirrors along the south coast, vast concrete structures shaped like dishes, could detect the sound of approaching engines, but they were already obsolete. Modern aircraft were simply too fast. By the time the mirrors picked up an engine noise, the bomber was already overhead. Wimperis took Rowe's warning seriously. With approval from the Secretary of State for Air, he proposed the creation of a scientific advisory committee, a small group of the best minds in Britain tasked with a single question: how could science defend this island from the air? On the 28th of January 1935, the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence held its first meeting. The chairman was Henry Tizard. The members were extraordinary. Archibald Vivian Hill, a biophysicist who had already won the Nobel Prize in 1922 for his work on muscle physiology. Patrick Blackett, a Cambridge physicist and veteran of the Battle of Jutland, who would win the Nobel Prize in 1948. Wimperis himself, and Rowe as secretary. This was not a bureaucratic talking shop. This was a committee with 2 Nobel laureates, a combat veteran, a former test pilot, and one very frightened junior official who had read the files and understood what was coming. Between them, they would build the system that saved Britain from the Luftwaffe. But first, they had to solve a problem that the entire military establishment considered unsolvable. They had to find a way to see the invisible. The committee's first move was to ask a simple question and get a world-changing answer. Harry Wimperis wrote to Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist working at the National Physical Laboratory, and asked whether radio waves could be used as a weapon. Could a beam of electromagnetic energy be focused tightly enough to harm an aircraft or its crew? The idea was known in the press as the ray of destruction, a science fiction fantasy that the public desperately wanted to be real. Watson Watt passed the question to his assistant, Arnold Wilkins, who ran the calculations and came back with a firm answer: no. The energy required to heat a pilot's blood by even a fraction of a degree would be astronomically beyond anything available. A radio weapon was physically impossible. But Wilkins added something else. He recalled that post office engineers had noticed an odd phenomenon. BBC radio signals were disrupted whenever an aircraft flew near a transmitter. The plane was reflecting the radio waves. You could not harm an aircraft with radio energy, but you could detect it. Watson Watt submitted a secret memorandum on the 12th of February 1935, titled simply Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, then responsible for research and development at the Air Ministry, read it and demanded a practical demonstration. Not theory, proof. 14 days later, on the 26th of February, in a muddy field near the village of Upper Stowe in Northamptonshire, roughly 6 miles from the BBC's powerful shortwave transmitter at Daventry, Watson Watt, Wilkins, and A.P. Rowe set up receiving equipment in the back of a delivery van. A Handley Page Hayford bomber was ordered to fly repeated passes at altitudes between 1,000 and 6,000 feet. The cathode ray tube inside the van showed a clear green blip. The aircraft had been detected at a range of up to 8 miles. Dowding released funding immediately. By June of that year, detection ranges reached 16 miles. By December, 60 miles. All work on acoustic detection was abandoned. Britain had found its invisible shield. But here is what separates Tizard from every other committee chairman in Whitehall. Robert Watson Watt invented the technology. Henry Tizard made it win a war. Watson Watt himself understood this distinction perfectly. His philosophy was blunt. Always give the military the third best, because the best is impossible, and the second best always arrives too late. Tizard shared this ruthless pragmatism. He did not wait for radar to be perfected. He made it operational while it was still crude, still unreliable, still a prototype, held together with spit and optimism. Tizard personally developed what became known as the Tizzy angle, a method for rapidly calculating the interception point where a fighter could meet an incoming bomber. He imagined the two aircraft at opposite corners of a triangle and worked out the geometry in a way that any operations room officer could apply in seconds. Before this method, interception exercises produced dismal results. After its introduction, success rates climbed consistently above 90%. And then Tizard did something even more important. Working alongside Dowding and Blackett, he designed the entire operational architecture that would turn raw radar data into coordinated fighter defense. Filter rooms to clean up false signals, sector stations to direct individual squadrons, Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory to oversee the whole battle. He personally convinced skeptical pilots that they could no longer simply take off and hunt for the enemy. They had to trust the plotting table and follow instructions from the ground. By August of 1938, during the Munich crisis, 5 chain-home radar stations were already operational along Britain's coast. By the summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe came, more than 30 stations formed an unbroken electronic fence along the east and south coasts of England. The system was ready, and the man who built it was about to lose everything to a rival who had spent those critical years whispering in Winston Churchill's ear. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the man who destroyed Henry Tizard's career, not with bombs or bullets, but with a friendship. Frederick Alexander Lindemann was born on the 5th of April, 1886, in Baden-Baden, Germany. His American mother had traveled to the famous spa town to take the waters, a detail that would cause him passport difficulties for the rest of his life. His father was a wealthy Alsatian entrepreneur who had settled in England and made a fortune. Where Tizard came from an impoverished naval family and scraped by on scholarships, Lindemann inherited great wealth and the social confidence that came with it. He earned his doctorate in physics under the same Professor Nernst in Berlin, where he had first befriended Tizard. But while Tizard returned to England to get his hands dirty with practical engineering, Lindemann carved out a career in theoretical physics and, more importantly, in the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. Oxford colleagues joked about his social climbing. Why is Professor Lindemann like a Channel steamer? Because he runs from pier to pier. Physically, he was impossible to forget. Tall, sallow, whippet thin, always dressed entirely in black, Melton coat, bowler hat, umbrella. A former student described the effect he had on a room in vivid terms. A Dracula figure. When he came in, you could feel the temperature fall. He spoke softly but with complete self-assurance, as though stating facts that must be obvious to every schoolboy. He was a vegetarian, a teetotaler, a non-smoker, and a lifelong bachelor who lived on salads, egg whites, and olive oil. John Colville, Winston Churchill's private secretary, called him a dedicated hater. But Frederick Lindemann was no mere social climber. He had genuine physical courage, the kind that most scientists never need and would never seek. During the Great War, working at the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough, Lindemann tackled one of aviation's most terrifying problems, the spin. Aircraft were falling out of the sky in uncontrollable spirals, and no one understood the physics of recovery. Lindemann developed the mathematical theory of how to escape a spin. And then, despite having defective eyesight, he learned to fly, took an aircraft up alone, deliberately put it into a deadly spiral, and tested his own theory with his own life. He did this repeatedly. It was an act of extraordinary nerve, and it worked. It was also the act that won him Winston Churchill's admiration when the Duke of Westminster introduced them in 1921. Churchill valued courage above almost everything, and in Lindemann he found a man who had risked his neck for science, just as Churchill had risked his own in the trenches and at Omdurman. Their friendship was built on opposites. Churchill, the legendary eater, drinker, and cigar smoker. Lindemann, the ascetic who would barely touch food at Chartwell's magnificent dinner table. Churchill would insist his friend accept a tiny, carefully measured glass of brandy after the meal. But on one thing they were perfectly aligned. Both saw the German threat with absolute clarity, years before the rest of Britain's establishment was willing to look. Lindemann's great gift was translation. He could take the most complex scientific concept and explain it to Churchill in 5 minutes flat on the back of an envelope. Churchill declared that the professor's brain was a beautiful piece of mechanism. Lindemann's signature appears 86 times in the Chartwell Visitors Book, more than any other name. And when a member of Parliament once questioned Lindemann's influence, Churchill erupted with a phrase that revealed everything about the depth of that bond. "Love me, love my dog. And if you do not love my dog, you damn well cannot love me." This was the man who was about to walk into Tizard's committee and tear it apart. In the middle of 1935, Winston Churchill, then a backbench member of Parliament with no official power but enormous influence, pressured the Air Ministry to appoint Frederick Lindemann to Tizard's committee. The request was granted. It was a catastrophe. From the very first meeting, Lindemann operated by different rules. While the other members debated openly and sought consensus, Lindemann reported the committee's secret deliberations directly to Churchill, behind the backs of every colleague in the room. He refused to give radar the near-absolute priority that Tizard, Blackett, and Hill believed it deserved. Instead, he pushed relentlessly for his own pet project, aerial mines. The concept was simple. Parachute-borne devices, 14-inch cylinders trailing 2,000 feet of piano wire, would be dropped in curtains ahead of approaching bomber formations. Any aircraft that struck the wire would be brought down. The rest of the committee considered this impractical at best and a dangerous waste of resources at worst. Lindemann would not yield. In July of 1936, during the preparation of a committee report, the situation exploded. Lindemann launched an attack on Tizard so savage in its language that the secretaries had to be sent out of the room. What exactly was said behind that closed door has never been fully recorded, but the consequences were immediate. Patrick Blackett and Archibald Hill both resigned. Two Nobel Prize caliber scientists, simply unable to work alongside this man any longer. Tizard delivered an ultimatum to Lord Swinton, the Secretary of State for Air. Either remove Lindemann from the committee or accept my resignation. Swinton acted decisively. The committee was formally dissolved and reconstituted without Lindemann. His seat was given to Edward Appleton, a radiophysicist who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 1947. The message was clear. Radar came first. Lindemann did not. But Lindemann did not forgive, and he did not forget. He simply waited. Now consider the scorecard of their disagreements, because it reveals something extraordinary. The aerial mines. Some 10,000 were manufactured. Churchill, trusting Lindemann, placed an order for 1 million. When they were finally tested in the autumn of 1940, they proved to be a complete failure. Only one success was ever claimed. Tizard had predicted this outcome years earlier. He was right. The area bombing campaign. In March of 1942, Lindemann, by then elevated to Lord Cherwell and sitting at Churchill's right hand, produced a memorandum arguing that the systematic destruction of working-class housing in German cities would break civilian morale. He specifically recommended targeting working-class homes because, in his words, middle-class houses had too much space around them and would waste bombs. Tizard examined the calculations and concluded that Lindemann's estimates of potential destruction were 5 times too high. Blackett said 6 times too high. After the war, the official bombing survey revealed the true figure. Lindemann had been 10 times too high. Meanwhile, Blackett later argued that the Battle of the Atlantic was very nearly lost in the dark winter of 1942–43 for lack of long-range aircraft that had been diverted to the bombing campaign. Tizard was right. The V-2 rockets. When intelligence reports suggested that Germany was developing a long-range ballistic missile, Lindemann dismissed the entire program as a hoax. His exact words, "To put a 4,000 horsepower turbine in a 20-inch space is lunacy. It simply cannot be done." The rockets were not only real, they began falling on London in September of 1944. Lindemann was spectacularly wrong. On every major scientific question of the war, Tizard's judgment proved sound, and Lindemann's proved flawed. Yet it was Lindemann who held power, and Tizard who was cast into the wilderness. Because in the corridors of Whitehall, being right counted for nothing. If the wrong man had the Prime Minister's ear. In May of 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, and overnight, Frederick Lindemann's power became almost absolute. He was appointed personal advisor to the Prime Minister on scientific matters, answerable to no committee, no ministry, no one except Churchill himself. Bold men protested to Churchill about Lindemann's influence. Charles Percy Snow later wrote that they were shown out of the room. Tizard, the man who had built the radar system now being tested in real combat over the English Channel, attempted to make peace with his old rival. Lindemann's response was ice cold. "Now that I am in a position of power, a lot of my old friends have come sniffing around." Within 3 weeks, Tizard resigned from every key advisory position he held. His assessment was bitter but precise. The trouble is that the man with the wrong ideas has, to support him, all the drive and enthusiasm of Mr. Winston Churchill. But even as Tizard's career in Whitehall collapsed, a far larger crisis was unfolding. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk with almost none of its equipment. The Luftwaffe was massing across the Channel. Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion plan, appeared imminent. Britain stood entirely alone. And Britain had a problem that no amount of courage could solve. The island nation had produced some of the most extraordinary scientific breakthroughs in history. Radar, the jet engine, the cavity magnetron, advances in nuclear physics. But it did not have the factories. It did not have the industrial capacity to mass-produce the weapons its scientists had conceived. British genius had created the future. British industry could not build it fast enough to survive. The decision that followed was an act of breathtaking boldness and breathtaking desperation. Britain would share everything, Every secret, every blueprint, every prototype, handed freely to the United States of America, a nation that was still officially neutral, that had no treaty obligation to help, and that offered no guarantee of anything in return. It was the greatest gamble in the history of technological warfare. If those secrets fell into the wrong hands, or if America simply took the knowledge and walked away, Britain would have given up its only advantage for nothing. And the man chosen to carry that burden across the Atlantic was Henry Tizard, the scientist whom his own government had just discarded. On the 14th of August 1940, one day after Adlertag, the Day of the Eagle, when the Luftwaffe launched its massive aerial assault on Britain, Henry Tizard boarded a short Empire flying boat named Clare. He flew west across the Atlantic via Newfoundland to Washington. Behind him, the Battle of Britain was beginning in earnest. The system he had built, the radar chain, the filter rooms, the sector stations, was being tested not in exercises, but in real combat against the most powerful air force in the world. The rest of the mission team would follow by sea. John Cockcroft, a Cambridge nuclear physicist who would win the Nobel Prize in 1951. Edward George Bowen, known to everyone as Taffy, the Welsh physicist who had pioneered airborne radar and was considered the foremost expert on the subject in the world. Brigadier Wallace, representing the Army, Captain Faulkner for the Navy, Group Captain Pierce for the Royal Air Force, and Arthur Woodward Nutt from the Air Ministry as Secretary. The secrets they carried travelled in a metal deed box, the ordinary kind used by solicitors to store wills and property contracts. It was lockable, but it was not armoured. Its one special feature was grimly practical. If the ship went down, the box was designed to fill with water and sink. Britain's greatest technological achievements would go to the bottom of the Atlantic, rather than float into the hands of a German salvage crew. The security arrangements for this priceless cargo were, by any rational standard, farcical. The night before departure, magnetron number 12 sat under Taffy Bowen's bed in a London hotel. The next morning, the deed box was strapped to the roof of a taxicab and driven through the streets of London, a city being bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe. At Euston Station, an over-eager railway porter grabbed the case and nearly vanished into the crowd. Bowen chased after him, heart pounding, and caught up just in time. For a few seconds, Britain's most closely guarded secrets had been in the hands of a man who thought he was carrying someone's legal papers. Only when the team reached Liverpool did the magnetron finally receive a full army escort. On the 28th of August, the main party sailed aboard the Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond. She carried more than 1,000 men of the Royal Navy, heading to America to crew the destroyers being exchanged under the Destroyers for Bases agreement. German U-boats were hunting in wolf packs across the North Atlantic. It was one of the most dangerous ocean crossings of the entire war. Now, what was in that box? The crown jewel was cavity magnetron number 12, type E1189. It had been invented just months earlier by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham, working under Professor Mark Oliphant. It was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, and it could generate approximately 10 kilowatts of microwave power at a wavelength of 10 centimeters, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than anything the Americans possessed. This single device made practical airborne radar, precision submarine detection from the air, and centimetric gun-laying radar all possible for the first time. Beside it lay the complete technical specifications for the chain-home radar system, the G hyperbolic navigation system, airborne intercept radar for night fighters, air-to-surface vessel radar for hunting submarines, the concept and early research for the proximity fuse, a shell that could detect a nearby aircraft and detonate automatically without needing a direct hit, information on Frank Whittle's revolutionary jet engine, gyroscopic gun sights, self-sealing fuel tanks, plastic explosives, rocket propulsion data, and perhaps most consequential of all, the Frisch-Piles Memorandum, the first practical calculation demonstrating that an atomic weapon was not just theoretical speculation, but an engineering problem that could be solved with a relatively small quantity of uranium-235. The crucial meeting took place on the 19th of September at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. The host was Dr. Alfred Lee Loomis, chairman of the American National Defense Research Committee's Microwave Committee. The Americans had been struggling for months with their own microwave radar program, but their klystron tubes could produce only about 10 watts of power, far too little for any practical military application. Taffy Bowen, with a flourish that has become legendary in the history of technology, opened the deed box, produced the magnetron, and explained what it could do. The American committee was stunned. On the 6th of October, Bowen demonstrated the magnetron at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Whippany, New Jersey. It produced over 10 kilowatts at 3 gigahertz. The Americans had nothing remotely comparable. James Finney Baxter III, the official historian of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, whose account later won the Pulitzer Prize, wrote that when the members of the Tizard mission brought the cavity magnetron to America, they carried the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. Britain had given everything. Now it was America's turn to build. The Americans moved with a speed that stunned even the British. On the 25th of October 1940, barely a month after Taffy Bowen had opened that deed box in Washington, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology formally established the Radiation Laboratory. The name was chosen deliberately to mislead. Anyone hearing it would assume the work involved nuclear physics. In reality, this was the most ambitious radar development program the world had ever seen. The director was Lee Dubridge, a nuclear physicist from the University of Rochester. His deputy was Isidor Isaac Rabi, who would later win the Nobel Prize. Taffy Bowen himself stayed on as British liaison, ensuring that the knowledge flowed freely between the two nations. The scale of what followed defies belief. At its peak, the Radiation Laboratory employed nearly 4,000 people and consumed $4 million every month. Over the course of the war, it generated approximately $1.5 billion in industrial contracts, equivalent to tens of billions in today's money. 9 members of that laboratory would eventually receive Nobel Prizes. It designed roughly half of all radar systems deployed by the Allies during the war, over 100 different types. And it all began with a single British magnetron. In January of 1941, just 3 months after receiving magnetron number 12, the Rad Lab team successfully tested their first 10-centimeter radar from the rooftop of Building 4 on the MIT campus. Bell Telephone Laboratories, meanwhile, had produced the first 30 American-made magnetrons within weeks of examining the British original. By the end of the war, American factories had manufactured over 1 million magnetrons. The weapons that emerged from this partnership transformed every theater of the conflict. The SCR-584 gun-laying radar, combined with the proximity fuse, created an anti-aircraft system of devastating accuracy. When the Germans launched their V-1 flying bombs against Britain, batteries equipped with this technology destroyed 85% of the targets they engaged. A single anti-aircraft unit defending the port of Antwerp destroyed 48 out of 75 V-1s in a single engagement. In the Atlantic, airborne radar turned the tide against the U-boats. Aircraft equipped with centimetric radar could now detect a submarine's periscope or conning tower from miles away, even at night, even in fog. The effect was dramatic. In November of 1942, German submarines sank 117 Allied ships. By the autumn of 1943, monthly losses had fallen to single digits, while 25 U-boats were destroyed in September and October alone. The hunters had become the hunted. The proximity fuse alone became one of the war's most decisive weapons. Over 22 million were produced at a total cost of approximately $1 billion. The unit price fell from over $700 in 1942 to just $18 by 1945, a testament to the sheer manufacturing power of American industry. In the Pacific, Japanese military commanders later cited the uncanny accuracy of American anti-aircraft fire as one of the reasons they shifted to kamikaze tactics. They simply could not understand how so many of their aircraft were being brought down. And then there was the atomic dimension. John Cockcroft had briefed American scientists on British nuclear research and carried the implications of the Frisch-Piles Memorandum. When the head of the American Uranium Committee reportedly locked the critical British research reports in his safe without showing them to his own committee members, Professor Mark Oliphant, the same Birmingham physicist who had overseen the magnetron's creation, flew personally to America in August of 1941 to ensure the findings reached the right people. That intervention helped accelerate the program that became the Manhattan Project. British genius had conceived these technologies. American industrial power built them by the million. It was the most productive scientific partnership in the history of warfare. And it all traced back to a metal deed box, a London taxi, and one man's decision to give everything away. After the war, Henry Tizard returned to positions of influence. He became chairman of the Defense Research Policy Committee and chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Defense. He was made a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, one of the highest honors the Crown can bestow. From the outside, it looked like vindication. But Tizard knew the truth. The years that mattered, 1940 to 1945, the years when scientific direction could have shortened the conflict and saved countless lives, had been spent in exile. He had been right about radar, right about the aerial mines, right about the bombing estimates, right about the strategic direction of the war. And none of it had mattered, because the man with the wrong answers had the Prime Minister's absolute trust. Charles Percy Snow, who studied their rivalry more closely than anyone, recorded Tizard's private belief. He was convinced to the end of his life that if he had been granted a fair share of the scientific direction between 1940 and 1945, the war might have ended earlier and with less cost. In 1949, Tizard delivered a speech that proved to be the most prophetic statement any British public figure made in the 20th century. He said, "We persist in regarding ourselves as a great power, capable of everything, and only temporarily handicapped by economic difficulties. We are not a great power, and never will be again. We are a great nation. But if we continue to behave like a great power, we shall soon cease to be a great nation." 75 years later, those words still echo. Henry Tizard passed away on the 9th of October, 1959, in Fareham, Hampshire. He was 74 years old. The obituaries were respectful but brief. He did not receive the state funeral or the national mourning that his contribution arguably deserved. Frederick Lindemann, Lord Churchill, had passed away 2 years earlier, in 1957, having served Churchill faithfully to the end and received every honor the establishment could offer. Snow drew the moral of their story in his famous Harvard lectures. If you are going to have a scientist in a position of absolute power, the only scientist among non-scientists, it is dangerous, whoever he is. The lesson was not that Lindemann was evil or that Churchill was foolish. The lesson was that when one man holds the sole channel between science and power, and that man happens to be wrong, there is no mechanism to correct the error. Tizard's committee had been that mechanism, a group of brilliant, independent minds who could challenge each other and arrive at the truth. Lindemann destroyed it and replaced it with a single voice, his own. Consider what Henry Tizard accomplished. He took radar from a laboratory curiosity and turned it into the integrated air defense system that won the Battle of Britain. He organized the most consequential transfer of military technology in history, freely, without conditions, at a moment when Britain stood alone and had nothing left to bargain with, except its genius. The cavity magnetron he carried to America sparked the creation of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, which produced half the radar systems that won the war. The proximity fuse that traveled in his deed box became one of the 3 most decisive weapons of the conflict. The nuclear research his mission shared helped set in motion the Manhattan Project. And for all of this, his own government pushed him aside in favor of a man who championed parachute mines that never worked, bombing estimates that were 10 times too high, and a conviction that German rockets were a fantasy. There is one final irony. When Tizard was stopped by an American policeman at the United States-Canada border during the mission and told that he could not cross without a passport, he produced his British Association membership card instead. The officer studied it and said, "The American government does not recognize British science." Tizard replied, "Oh, that is all right. Neither does the British government." He meant it as a joke, but like everything else Henry Tizard said, it turned out to be the truth. America received the magnetron, the jet engine, the proximity fuse, the atomic research, the radar that won the Atlantic, the technology that built the modern world.